Welcome in this bonus video of the retrospective of Chow Yun-Fat. Why am I doing such a bonus video? For a simple reason, because between the time I shot the original 3-part retrospective of Chow Yun-Fat and until the time it was finally published, I managed to watch a couple more of Chow Yun-Fat films, actually 3 films. And so I thought it's better to do a bonus video like this in order to have as many Chow Yun-Fat films being dealt with. So let's go ahead and let's start the first of the 3 films I'm going to talk about. And this film is called The Executor, directed in 1981 by Chuen. So The Executor is a cop story. It's roughly 2/3 investigation cop story, 1/3 court drama. It's very simple, very basic story. You have an important witness which was disappeared, and the cop has to manage to find him back so that he can give a testimony in the court in order to have the big crime boss convicted. So it's really nothing original when it comes to the story. And unfortunately, that's quite emblematic of the film in general. I don't know if you remember when I did the first part of the Chow Yun-Fat retrospective. I was talking at some point of Hot Blood, a cop film which Chow Yun-Fat had done a few years prior, A Better Tomorrow. And each time you watch a Chow Yun-Fat film which is a cop film, you can't resist having some kind of expectations. You always think, oh, are we going to see the sparks that we saw in A Better Tomorrow? And each time it disappoints, and that's again the case here with The Executor. It's another disappointment. It's a very dull, very weak film. It's especially more disappointing because there is once again this situation as with The Occupant. The Occupant was the first film in which Sally Ye and Chow Yun-Fat were working together quite a few years before The Killer. And The Executor is actually the first film which has Danny Lee and Chow Yun-Fat together. So a few years before City on Fire, a few years before The Killer. But don't expect anything special because unfortunately the film itself, as I said, is pretty bad. When it comes to the meeting of Danny Lee and Chow Yun-Fat, they actually have only one scene together, one scene where Chow Yun-Fat is kind of torturing Danny Lee, but it's really nothing special. I mean, nothing special at all. Having said that, the film is interesting because when it comes to scared stiff, I say that that was one of the only times that Chow Yun-Fat was playing a bad guy. I was not completely wrong, but I was partially wrong. That was not the first time. That was one of the first time, yes, but not the first time because he is playing a bad guy here in The Executor. He's basically some kind of professional killer who is working for the bad guy, for the main bad guy, and he is tasked with killing the people who have to take part in the court, in the jury. So that's his part. To be honest, I don't find him very convincing playing this kind of real killer with a cold heart. He already played killers like in The Killer or in Story of Who Viet, but each time it's more like the killer with a heart of gold. I mean, you can see he has a good side, a positive side to him, which is needed because you are supposed to feel for the character, so he needs to have this side, and that's something which Chow Yun-Fat managed to bring very well. But here, as he's playing really a pure bad guy with no heart of gold or whatever, just killing, just making other people suffer. I find he has his face is too nice. I mean, there is something which doesn't fit. He doesn't manage for me to be convincing as this ardent killer. There is something missing. So its performance is not really noteworthy, but as I said, it's in the spirit of the film itself. I mean, the film itself is quite boring, so it's nothing surprising to see that Chow Yun-Fat is not really 1 or 2 levels higher than that. One of the maybe one of the saving grace, but it's not really enough. But if you really want to look for something interesting in this film, well, you can rely at least on the supporting cast. There is a good supporting cast. You have Mantat, you have Lily Lee, you have Kwan Oi-san, you have Paul Chuen. So the usual supporting actors were always quite good, but even then, I mean, they can't really make the film good just by being there. But if, like me, you like this kind of supporting actors from the Hong Kong film industry of the 80s, it's always a pleasure to watch them. There is also an okay fight scene at the end with Chow Yun-Fat. It's not a fight scene well choreographed or anything like this, but it's more realistic. It's more like a street fight, so the characters throwing themselves, trying to punch their way, not in a fancy way or anything pretty, but the scene has some energy, and the players, the actors really seems to try their best to put as much energy, to put as much physical performance in the scene. So it makes it watchable. But is it worth enough watching the film? No, and completely not. But that's one of the things which you may end up thinking, okay, this one was fine. But that's really one of the very few scenes where you will have this kind of thinking. I guess that's also an opportunity to talk a little bit about Chuen, because I don't think I will have many opportunities to talk about him. Chuen is basically the best trajectory you could hope for a stuntman. He was originally a stuntman, and then he evolved into an action director, a choreographer. He worked actually on some fairly big titles. For example, for Shaw Brothers, he was a choreographer on The King Boxer, on Boxer from Shantung, and then he moved to Golden Harvest, and he worked on films like When Taekwondo Strikes, Stoner for Wong Fung, and later on also for John Woo on Dragon Tamers, one of his first films for Golden Harvest. And then at the end of the 70s, he transitioned as a director. He became a director, and he directed at first several kung fu films. He did Kung Fu versus Yoga, he did Two Fists Against the Law, which are fairly mediocre. Well, mediocre maybe is a bit too harsh. Fairly average kung fu film. He was also responsible for the weird product that was the sequel of the Fearless Hyena. So I don't know if you're aware of that. Jackie Chan, after having worked with MC-Yun on Snake in the Eagle Shadow and Drunken Master, had to go back to working with Lo Wai, for which he was under contract, and he directed Fearless Hyena, which was a success, and that got the attention of Golden Harvest, who proposed him a very interesting contract with a lot of money. And so what Jackie did was he actually started working on the sequel of Fearless Hyena for Lo Wai, but at the same time going to Golden Harvest, working on his first film for them in breach of his contract. And so the whole contract situation was solved after some tough time, including trials and stuff. And that's Chuen who ended up being tasked to finish the sequel of Fearless Hyena, which Jackie didn't finish. And so that's how we got this weird film which reused some footage of the original Fearless Sienna, which used some footage shot by Jackie for the sequel, and some completely new footage directed by Chuen with Austin Wire. So that's him who did this Frankenstein creature of a film, which actually I find kind of entertaining. Maybe I will be highly criticized for that, but I actually kind of enjoyed the sequel of Fearless Sienna. It's a mess, but it's quite enjoyable. Anyway, as you can see from this works, Chuen has never been a very good director, and that is proven again in The Executor. And he kept doing films for quite a while, well into the end of the 80s. Even his last film is at the end of the 90s. That was a movie with Yuka Hiroshima, which is very, very bad, shot on video. I mean, with an abysmal budget, I guess, and it was really atrocious. So yeah, not very good director. We end up not doing a very good film as we could expect. And Chow Yun-Fat, unfortunately, is at the image of the film itself. So not a recommendation in my book. Anyway, we move to the second film, which is Spiritual Love, directed by Taylor Wong and David Lai in 1987. The Spiritual Love is basically a remake of a Chinese ghost story, but set in a contemporary Hong Kong. So back then, a Chinese ghost story had been a good success. It was not an incredible success, but it had made some money, and it had gathered a lot of attention from overseas markets, especially. I think it was more of a success in Taiwan and Korea than it was in Hong Kong comparatively. And so the producers in Hong Kong saw it, obviously, and as they were always doing back then, they did some copy very quickly. And so you had the Golden Harvest copy, which was Picture of a Nymph, with directed by Wuma with Yun Biu and Joy Wong. You had Golden Swallow. You had several films like this. And Spiritual Love is in the same mold, except that it takes place in the Hong Kong of the 80s. Chow Yun-Fat plays the part of Leslie Chung, and it's Chai Chung who is replacing Joy Wong. The film is produced by the Mack brothers, Tony and Michael Mack. The Mack brothers, their style is to always mix a bit of social issue and at the same time doing something very commercial and quite often vulgar. There is always this balance of these two elements in their films. And in their early films, the social elements was actually the one which was more present compared to the vulgar element. And the more they moved into their career, the more they kept going, the more the vulgarity, the commercial elements increased and the social ones decreased. And so Spiritual Love is already at this point where the social part is already quite reduced. There is a bit of it. There is a bit of it in the film, but for the most part, it gets more into this kind of highly commercial, a bit vulgar aspect, and that can be seen in the character of Chow Yun-Fat, who is a small criminal, we can say, who get back the money from the people who have borrowed money from a triad. So he's this kind of street smart, a bit arrogant, a bit looking more trying to look more tough than he really is. So this kind of character, which were quite used regularly in the Mack brothers film, but in my opinion that doesn't make him very nice. I mean, that's not the character. He managed to make it nice enough that you are going to kind of root for him, but it's not the most interesting or most pleasant character you will see in a film. As I said, the film was directed by Taylor Wong and David Lai, and each time there is this kind of dual credit, you always wonder who did what. And fortunately for me, I had the chance to interview David Lai, so of course I took advantage of it in order to ask him who did what on this film. And so the main director is Taylor Wong, and David Lai just came as some kind of super second unit director in order to make the movie being finished faster. So the main director is Taylor Wong. Taylor Wong, who I already talked about for Triads, The Inside Story, and with a director who usually have good ideas on paper but who never managed to deliver, and that's a bit the case here in Spiritual Love. There are two good things in the film, though, in my opinion. The first one is we have, as in Chinese Ghost Story, we have a Taoist priest character. In Chinese Ghost Story it was played by Wu Ma, and in this one the character is played by Denny Yip. And Denny Yip is a very good actress, and I think she brings a different kind of vibe to a Taoist priest character, and that makes it interesting to watch. But she has a supporting part, so that's just a secondary element in the story. On the second point, which I think is quite decent, it's the ending. The ending is a big fight full of fantasy elements in a nightclub. The special effects are quite charming, and they work pretty well. There are a bit of some hell-like visions, and it works for the most part. It's quite well handled, and with a quick rhythm. So this sequence is quite watchable. Is it worth checking the film for itself? Not so sure. And even for Chow Yun-Fat, I would not necessarily highly recommend it. It's watchable, but it's really nothing more. And Chow Yun-Fat is once again, like the Executor, is at the image of the film itself. Is okay, but nothing special. It doesn't elevate the film to another level. And the third film I want to discuss in this bonus video regarding Chow Yun-Fat's career, it's Anna and the King, directed by Andy Tennant in 1999. So Anna and the King is a readaptation of the same film which was done 30 years before, if I'm correct, with Yul Brynner in the part here played by Chow Yun-Fat. It's based on a book by an English teacher who ended up teaching the children of the King of Siam, but you have to be aware that the book is full of lies, actually. The teacher was kind of a mythomaniac. I mean, she came up with a lot of story, a lot of ideas which actually never happened. And so that makes it for not a very good base for a serious historical film. But anyway, the film is a mixed bag. I will start with the good points. First, the historic reconstitution is actually pretty good. You have some nice palace, nice recreation of the market, this kind of things, nice costumes. There is really some work which has been done on this aspect, and it really shows in the film, and it's really appreciated because that's not often that we have occasions to see Thailand, Siam during the 19th century. And on that part they have done a pretty good job. I really appreciated, for example, that there is a scene, a market scene, in which Jodie Foster is buying some food and stuff, and in the background, just in the background, you will see that there are some people dressed in a Qing dynasty costume, and that's because back then there were a lot of Chinese traders or Chinese who had moved to Southeast Asia in order to continue their life there, and that's an element which is present in the film, but which is not in your face. It's really just in the background. But I think it really helps to recreate and to make it to make the Constitution believable. So that's really a very good point there, in my opinion. Another good point for the film, it's that the Jodie Foster Chow Yun-Fat duo is working pretty well. It's not full of sparks. I think it could have been even more close, even more feelings between them. But it's also probably because of their characters. I mean, there is a bit of a distance between the teacher and the king because he is the king, and so that can be explained partly because of the story, because of the characters. So in general, I would say the Jodie Foster Chow Yun-Fat duo on love relationship kind of works pretty well. It's especially not worthy to have a film from Hollywood, and especially from 1999, dealing with a romance between an Asian man and a Western woman. For two reasons, in my opinion. First, because too often Hollywood had the tendency to desexualize Asian men, and on the contrary, over-sexualize Asian women. And so here there is a bit of a change on that, with the character of Chow Yun-Fat being an object of desire, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing, and that's especially a good thing when the film was made, because even if now we are talking a little bit more about Asians in Hollywood films, back then that was really almost a non-entity kind of. So that's really not worthy, and that's really a good point to the advantage of the film. The second reason why I think that's a good thing is because it's actually an historical reality, and that's something we may not be really aware of. In my case, I made a bit of research on that, but my research were about China, and I'm assuming, maybe wrongly, I will be corrected if I'm saying some mistakes there, but I'm assuming that was the same as the rest of Southeast Asia. And so what I'm saying there is that back then, during the 19th century, the couple were more often Western women and Asian men, and there was much less Asian women, Western men, which now is, this combination is kind of seen everywhere, but that was really the opposite one, which was the most common one back then, for a lot of reasons, partly because back then women in the West were kind of educated but didn't have all the rights, didn't have all the rights that they should, they were entitled to, and so some of them were adventurous and wanted to escape this kind of social pressure, this kind of unfair laws, and that brought them to Asia, and they met men, usually Asian men. These Asian men usually were not peasant, they were the people who were highly educated, from a bourgeois background or aristocratic background, and who had usually been partially educated in the West, and so they ended up being couple, and probably because there was also some love involved, I hope, for them. But so back then in the 19th century, this kind of couple were kind of the trend. I mean, it was still a very small minority, but it was something which existed, which was real, and that's on that. Anna the King is faithful to some kind of reality there. And the last thing, which I think is to the benefit of the film, is that it respects the language being used. The Siam character speaks their own language when they are between themselves, and then they speak English when they are with the English characters, and I think that's a very important thing. That really helps for you to feel how it was back then, how it is, to feel like it's a real story. There is not this kind of fantasy which too often Hollywood is using, of having all the characters speak English. It makes no sense. I mean, as soon as I see that personally, I cannot restrain myself from going a bit away from the film. I mean, I have difficulty to really get into it when I see this kind of fiction that all the characters, like all the German characters during the Second World War, are speaking English between themselves. I mean, that's so wrong. Anyway, so that's not the case in this film, except for a couple of scenes. There are a couple of scenes where they do that. I don't get why, because most of the time they don't, and that's a very good thing. But yeah, a couple of scenes they do it, weirdly. But so, most of the film they don't, and so there is this language barrier which is present, and which would have been the case. And I think that's a very good thing that the film respected that. Now, having said that, that was the good points, but the film is far from perfect for several reasons. There is, unfortunately, a bit of cliche approach, a bit of Orientalism in the depiction of life in Siam back then, which is kind of expected, because each time Hollywood is doing this kind of historical film set in Asia, there is always this aspect. I mean, they just cannot avoid it. It's an Hollywood film, so it's kind of expected, but you have to be aware of that. It's done in a specific perspective, and sometimes that brings oversimplification and yeah, a bit of cliche when it comes to this kind of depiction of other culture. Another thing which is not that convincing, it's basically the direction of Andy Tennant. It's not bad per se. He's obviously trying to channel the spirit of the directors of this kind of films, like David Lean. So he has a quite academic style of direction. But sometimes I think it would require to be a bit more imaginative, to be a bit more creative. It could have helped sometimes if he had tried to go a little bit further than this kind of convention. And the last point, which I think is a problem for the film, it's basically too long. 2 hours 30 minutes for the story that it tells. I'm not sure that's really needed. I think it could easily have been shortened of 20 minutes easily. So for these reasons, the film is a mixed bag. But it's still, if you take it in the context of Chow Yun-Fat's American filmography, and if you remove Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, because even if it is to some extent an Hollywood film, I still think it's mostly a Chinese film. So if you remove Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, I would say Anna and the King is the second best film behind The Corruptor, because he has the possibility to really show a wide range of acting. This character has a lot of different things to do, so that gives him more opportunities, and he is present on the screen quite a long time. It's not just all Jodie Foster, it's really a duo between the two of them. So for this reason, I think it's not a bad attempt, a bad mark in his Hollywood career, and so it's at least worth a small recommendation. It's far from being a masterpiece, but it's certainly watchable. And the last film to review in this bonus video of the Chow Yun-Fat retrospective, that's The Last Tycoon, directed by Wong Ting in 2012. Of course, we needed to have a Wong Ting. I mean, you can't escape Wong Ting if you are talking about Hong Kong Chinese cinema. In my book, I already noticed that Wong Ting seems to have a real liking for the Hong Kong of the past, the Hong Kong from the 50s until the 70s. Because when he's producing, when he's directing films about this time period, they are always quite serious. They are always made with much more care than when he's doing his kind of crazy comedy. And I think this extends to Shanghai in the 30s, because The Last Tycoon and some other film he has produced during that time period is a fairly serious film. It's a classic rise and fall. We follow the footpath of Chow Yun-Fat from being a young, poor teenager moving to Shanghai, then being involved with the crime syndicate of the city, and then rising in the organization until he reached the pinnacle of the crime syndicate. That's a classic structure, classic narration, which is followed here. Wong Ting must have been aware that was maybe a little bit too usual, too conventional, and so he tries to complexify a little bit by alternating between the present being Shanghai in the 30s, and the past. So we have a sequence with Chow Yun-Fat in the 30s as a crime boss, and we see him young, played by Wang Xiaoming, and trying to make his way into the organization, and so that alternate during the whole film like this. And it's actually a good idea indeed. It makes the narration a little bit more dynamic rather than if he had just kept the things straightforward. Aside from that, we have a very nice cast. We have Chow Yun-Fat, who is very convincing as this crime boss with some values. It's something he has done already. He has played quite a few times by then. But alongside him, we have Sammo Hung playing his mentor. It's always a pleasure to see Sammo. We have Francis playing some kind of corrupt cop, and we also have Yasaki Kurata. Yasaki Kurata, of course, playing the Japanese bad guy, as it should be. And as I said, we have Wang Xiaoming playing the young Chow Yun-Fat, and is actually pretty convincing. I mean, Wang Xiaoming is it's often a hit or miss. It's really one or the other. Fortunately, in the Last Tycoon, it's rather a hit. It's quite okay. It's a men's film, as you can see. That the main characters are the men. Or there is a love story, and there is an interesting character in the wife of Sammo Hung, which has a bit of development, but otherwise it's mostly a man film. But having said that, it's actually quite well done. It's nothing outstanding. It's not revolutionary, but if you want a good entertainment, a good description of the time, because the reconstitution of Shanghai in the 30s is really well done. It's actually a pretty good film, and I would say from amongst the four films I've been discussing here, that's probably the best one. As usual, when we are dealing with a Wong Ting film, you can always wonder if Wong Ting has really directed the whole film. There is Andrew Lo and Jason Kwan as a director of photography, so I have strong suspicions that they have actually directed parts of the film. I think the film is more like an Andrew Lo film than a typical Wong Ting feature, in my opinion. So I would not be surprised if Andrew Lo actually directed most of it. A little side note: it's interesting because at some point the characters, so the characters, the gangster characters, say that they are not doing any prostitution, drug, and gambling. And I really find this affirmation laughable, because if they don't do that, then as a crime syndicate, that doesn't leave them much else to do. That's not how crime syndicate operate. I mean, they jump at any occasion in order to make more money. And in the case of Shanghai in the 30s, I think those three activities were certainly the one which were the most profitable. So it's very hard to swallow when they are saying they are doing that. But it's a classical trick from narrative trick from the gangster films, which came back from the Godfather, the Francis Ford Coppola film, where what distinguished the bad mafia from the good mafia is the fact that the good mafia is not doing any drug trafficking. But in the case of the Coppola film, it actually was based on a reality, because there was at some point indeed in the Italian mafia in the US this kind of discussions. So that was based on some kind of reality, but I'm pretty sure this discussion never happened in between the triads in the Shanghai of the 30s. Actually, one of the, if not the biggest crime boss of Shanghai in the 30s was heavily involved in drug trafficking, and thanks to his political connection, he was also the head of the commission, the official commission, governmental commission against drug trafficking, which is kind of ironic. I guess the guy had some kind of sense of humor. So yeah, I found this distinction that they make in the film quite laughable. I'm not sure if it was made just in order to make them more relatable, more sympathetic for the audience, or if it was just to please the censors. I'm not sure. Anyway, despite this little flaw, in my opinion, the film is still a pretty entertaining, pretty well done gangster film. So if you want to have a fairly good entertainment, The Last Tycoon is actually a good choice. And that's it for this short bonus video, which at the end ends up not being so short. I don't think I will get back to Chow Yun-Fat's career, even if I watch a few more of the films which I have missed in the previous video. I will move on some with some other personalities. Of course, as usual, if you have any comment, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write them down in the comment section below, and I will see you in another video very soon.